Helen Carter sat at her kitchen table, a loaded gun resting between her trembling hands, as her husband Mark and their daughter Emily came down the stairs, unaware that within seconds everything they had carefully hidden from her would erupt in blood. What secret could drive a devoted wife and mother to kill the two people she loved most? And how long had they been planning to keep it from her? The Carter family lived in a two-story brick home at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac in Maple Grove, a small, wealthy suburb known for its manicured lawns, community barbecues, and near-perfect safety record. The house was neat, warm, and filled with framed photos of birthdays, holidays, and school awards. To the neighbors it was clear Helen and Mark Carter had built the kind of life most people dreamed of. Helen was the respected principal of the local elementary school. Mark, a reserved but kind man, worked as a software engineer from home. Their only child, Emily, had just completed her second year of college and returned home for the summer. She was bright, polite, and beautiful, with her mother's calm demeanor and her father's sharp mind. They were a family people admired from afar. The Carters never argued in public. They hosted modest but warm dinner parties. Helen always sent thank-you notes. Mark quietly fixed neighbors' computers. Emily often walked dogs for free around the block. They blended so seamlessly into the neighborhood's image of perfection that no one ever imagined anything could be wrong. But something was. That summer, things began to feel off. It started with small things, too small, at first for Helen to fully register. She would come home from work to find the living room lights dimmed when she was sure she'd left them off. Sometimes she'd hear footsteps in the hall late at night. When both Mark and Emily were supposedly asleep, the house felt colder, more hollow, as if something invisible had moved in with them. Helen dismissed it all as stress. Her job had become more demanding, and Emily's return from college came with the usual growing pains. Young adults often pulled away. It was normal. That's what she told herself, but the feeling that something wasn't quite right refused to leave her. It lingered in the air like a scent she couldn't place, faint but present. Then came the whispers. Twice, Helen heard Mark and Emily speaking quietly behind a closed door. When she walked in, they immediately went silent. Emily would smile and leave the room. Mark would change the subject. It wasn't alarming, just strange. Maybe they were planning a surprise, Helen thought, but the smiles were thin and forced. The silence that followed was thick and uncomfortable. One afternoon, Helen returned early from a school board meeting. She entered through the back door and heard the unmistakable sound of two voices in the garage. Mark and Emily. Their tones were low and serious. She couldn't make out the words, but there was tension in their voices, a rapid exchange that ended in a long silence. When she stepped into the hallway, they emerged from the garage, seconds later. Emily's face was flushed. Mark looked startled. They both froze for a moment too long before quickly explaining they had been cleaning out old boxes. Helen smiled and nodded, but something in her stomach turned. She waited until they were both upstairs and walked into the garage. There were no open boxes, no dust, nothing out of place. Just the faint smell of something metallic and cold. Over the next few days, Helen began to pay closer attention. Mark had always been a quiet man, but now he barely made eye contact with her. Emily stopped spending time in the kitchen where she used to chat with Helen for hours. Instead, she lingered near Mark's home office. Sometimes she went in and closed the door behind her. At night, Helen lay awake, listening to the creaks of the house. Every sound seemed loaded with meaning. Every whisper behind a door felt like a warning. She didn't have proof of anything. Not yet. But deep down, something primal told her that the family she had loved, the life she had built, was beginning to split at the seams. And the worst part was, she was the only one who seemed to notice. Helen began keeping mental notes of every change, every moment that felt off, as if piecing together a puzzle no one else could see. She didn't want to believe her instincts. After all, she'd built her entire life around stability, routine, discipline, control. But lately, things inside her home felt like they were slipping through her fingers. The shift in Emily was the most jarring. Just a month ago, she had returned from college with her usual cheerful energy, filling the house with laughter and stories. But within 2 weeks, that brightness had dulled. Emily stopped calling her college friends. She spent more time inside, often curled up on the couch, scrolling through her phone with a blank expression. Helen tried asking what was wrong, but Emily only responded with vague shrugs, or said she was tired. She had always been independent, but now she was detached, guarded, almost secretive. One Saturday morning, Helen walked past Emily's room and noticed the door slightly ajar. Emily wasn't there. The bed was made, the curtains drawn. Something caught Helen's eye on the desk, a small black notebook tucked under a stack of textbooks. She hesitated. She wasn't the type to snoop, but something about the way the house had changed made her reach for it. Before she could open it, footsteps came down the hall. She slipped away quickly, her heart pounding, telling herself she would never invade her daughter's privacy again. But the seed of suspicion had been planted. Later that evening, as she set the table for dinner, Helen watched Mark closely. He was distracted, answering questions with vague nods, his eyes flicking toward the stairs more often than usual. He seemed to be listening for something or someone. When Emily finally came down, he visibly relaxed. Helen noticed the look they exchanged. A brief glance, but one that carried weight. Not affection, not guilt, but something more complicated. She couldn't define it, but it sent a chill down her spine. The following week, Helen returned home unexpectedly early again, this time due to a power outage at the school. The house was quiet, too quiet. She placed her keys on the table and listened. Then, from upstairs, a sound footsteps, quickly followed by a door shutting. She moved silently up the staircase, her pulse in her ears. When she reached the top, she noticed Mark's office door was closed. Not locked, but shut. That alone was strange. He never closed it when Emily was home. She pressed her ear gently to the door. There was no talking, just the soft hum of a computer. And then, unmistakably, the creak of someone standing up, followed by silence. She backed away quickly and returned downstairs. Moments later, both Mark and Emily came down, acting as if nothing unusual had happened. Emily made tea. Mark asked about her day. It was all too smooth, too rehearsed. Helen knew then that something was being hidden from her. Not just suspicion, but certainty. It wasn't just a mother's intuition. There was something secret living inside her home, and her husband and daughter were guarding it together. The question that haunted her wasn't just what the secret was, but how far they would go to keep it from her. She started checking the house when they were out. Notebooks, drawers, files. She searched through old photo albums, bank statements, even Mark's desk. Nothing obvious turned up. But she began noticing things that hadn't registered before. A new key on the keyring. Mark always kept hidden in his sock drawer. A parking receipt for a location downtown she didn't recognize. A set of photos with corners bent and faded edges, hidden behind the lining of a desk drawer. She didn't take them out yet. She wasn't ready. She began to sleep lightly, waking at every noise. One night, at 2:14 a.m., she heard the garage door open. She crept to the window and looked down. Emily was stepping out into the night, wearing a hoodie and carrying something in her hands. Moments later, Mark followed. They walked down the driveway and out of sight. Helen didn't follow them that night. She stood at the window, trembling. She realized she wasn't just suspicious anymore. She was afraid. Helen sat alone in the kitchen the next morning, staring into her untouched cup of coffee. The events of the night before looped in her mind like a broken film reel. Emily slipping into the shadows, Mark following her without hesitation. She'd waited at the window for nearly an hour, but they hadn't returned until dawn. When they finally came back, they entered through the garage, silent and careful, as if trying not to wake someone, as if they knew they were being watched. That morning, Helen pretended to sleep in. She listened as Mark made breakfast, and Emily laughed lightly at something he said. They sounded normal, too normal. The kind of normal that didn't match what she had seen. Something had changed in their dynamic, And whatever it was, they were united in keeping it from her. She decided not to wait any longer. Mark left for a quick grocery run, just before noon. Emily was out walking the dog. It was the first time in days the house was completely hers. Helen moved quickly. She entered Mark's office with her heart racing. The room was always tidy, almost sterile, like a hotel room that no one really lived in. She sat at his desk and turned on the computer. The password screen glowed. Waiting, for years they had shared everything, including passwords. But his usual ones didn't work. After 3 failed tries, the screen locked. That alone was enough to deepen her suspicion. Frustrated, but undeterred, she began checking the drawers. Pens, old receipts, nothing unusual. Then, in the bottom drawer behind a set of folders, she found a flash drive. No label, no markings, just plain black plastic, cold to the touch. She plugged it into her own laptop and held her breath. It opened instantly. Inside was a single folder titled Projects. Harmless on the surface, but Helen knew her husband wasn't working on anything new. Not officially. She clicked it open. The files were encrypted. Dozens of them. But not all. Some were images. Others were scanned documents. She clicked through the unlocked ones first, and what she saw made her pulse slow and heavy. There were rental agreements for a downtown apartment under a different name. Mark's signature was there. But the tenant was listed as Thomas Baird. The payments had been made in cash. The apartment had been rented for 6 months now. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the rest. Gas station receipts near that address. A grocery store loyalty card linked to an email she'd never seen before. And then a photo, blurry, taken from behind but unmistakable. Emily, sitting on the edge of a bed, her back to the camera, a suitcase beside her. Helen's breath caught. She closed the laptop, chest tightening. A cold sweat covered her skin. The apartment wasn't just a secret from her, it was something Emily was directly involved in. Had they been living a second life without her? Was it innocent, or was it something else? Something darker? She went back into the office and searched further. Behind a row of technical manuals, she found a small notebook with half the pages torn out. On the remaining pages were odd lists, dates, times, dollar amounts. No names, just numbers. In one corner, scrawled in pencil, was a phrase that chilled her. Tell her when she's ready. Who was her? Was it Helen? Was it Emily? And ready for what? Suddenly, the sound of the garage door opening jolted her. Mark was back. Helen shoved everything back into place, turned off the laptop, and stepped into the hallway, heart pounding but face calm. When Mark entered the house, she greeted him with a smile. She had the answers to some questions now, but with every new clue, the mystery only grew deeper. Something was unraveling, something carefully buried, maybe for years. And now Helen had pulled the first thread. Helen no longer saw her home as a place of comfort. Each room now felt like a stage where secrets performed behind curtains. She wasn't meant to pull back. Every sound made her tense. Every glance between Mark and Emily seemed loaded with meaning she couldn't quite decode. She had entered a new phase, no longer questioning if something was wrong, but silently, methodically, beginning to expose how deep it ran. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she replayed every file she had seen on the flash drive. Hidden apartment. The cryptic notebook. The photo of Emily in that unfamiliar space. The phrase, "Tell her when she's ready." She knew they were hiding something, but the secrecy, the coordination suggested this wasn't a spontaneous affair. It was something carefully planned. Something that involved time, lies, and perhaps betrayal at a level she hadn't begun to grasp. The next morning, she said nothing. She packed her bag for work like always, kissed Mark on the cheek, and smiled as if nothing had changed. But instead of driving to school, she waited down the block and watched. At 9:12 a.m., Mark left the house with a small messenger bag and headed toward the city. Helen followed from a safe distance, heart thudding in her chest like a second heartbeat. He didn't go to his office building. He didn't meet a client or stop for coffee. He drove straight to a narrow street in the downtown warehouse district and pulled into an underground garage. Helen parked 2 blocks away and approached on foot. From a distance, she watched as he entered a narrow side door next to a hardware store. It had no sign, no buzzers, nothing to indicate it was anything more than an old building. He typed a code into a keypad and disappeared inside. She waited. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Then, without warning, another figure approached the building. A petite girl in a denim jacket. Long brown hair pulled into a bun. It was Emily. Helen's vision blurred. Her own daughter had just entered the same secret building her husband had been hiding for months. She stepped back behind a parked van, frozen in place. Minutes later, she saw the building's front window flicker with movement. 2 shadows crossing each other. She tried to see more, but the window was clouded, the angle bad. Her mind filled the silence with all the worst things a mother could imagine. She left before they came out. She couldn't bear to watch them walk out together. She needed to breathe, to scream, to cry. But she did none of those things. Instead, she drove straight to a hotel 15 miles away and booked a room under her maiden name. Then she sat in the dim light, scrolling through every message thread between Mark and Emily she could find on their shared iCloud account. Most had been deleted, but not all. One message, buried in an archived thread, stood out. From Mark to Emily. "I'll handle it. She's starting to notice too much." Helen dropped the phone onto the bed as if it burned her. She didn't return home until after dark. When she did, the house was just as she left it. Too quiet, too still. Mark was in his office. Emily was upstairs. Helen stood in the hallway, listening to the silence between them. There were no hushed voices, no laughter, just the kind of heavy quiet that told her everything had shifted. They knew she knew, and she knew now that whatever secret they were keeping, it was something she was never supposed to discover. The morning air was thick with heat, but Helen felt a coldness that clung to her skin like sweat. She had hardly slept, pacing the living room floor in the dark for hours, her mind spinning in endless loops. Every discovery, every strange detail she had tried to ignore, now piled on top of her, heavy and undeniable. She had seen enough to know that Mark and Emily were not just hiding something from her, they were protecting it, nurturing it, living it. Together. She sat at the kitchen table just after sunrise, staring at the wood grain beneath her hands. The house was silent, but not the kind of silence that brings peace. It was the silence of tension, of people moving carefully, measuring every word and step. She could feel them upstairs, still asleep or pretending to be. For days now, every interaction had felt rehearsed. The way Emily smiled with her mouth, but never her eyes. The way Mark touched her shoulder just a little too often, as if reassuring her silently. Helen had run out of guesses. All that remained was a sick certainty. She stood up and walked to the hallway closet, where an old wooden box sat tucked beneath a blanket. Inside it was a revolver, unregistered, left to her by her father, a relic of another life. She had never used it, never even considered it. But this morning, she didn't hesitate. She picked it up and held it in her palm, as though weighing something more than metal. Then she waited. She sat at the table, motionless, listening for the sounds of waking. The light changed slowly through the windows, turning gold, then soft blue. At last, she heard the floorboards above creak. A door opened. Footsteps. They were coming downstairs. She didn't move. Emily appeared first, her hair pulled back, wearing Mark's oversized sweatshirt. She stopped when she saw her mother at the table. Her expression didn't show surprise. It showed calculation. Seconds later, Mark followed, dressed in jeans and a shirt Helen didn't recognize. He too hesitated when he saw Helen, but recovered quickly. He walked toward the coffee machine, acting as though it were a normal morning, but the tension in the air was sharp enough to cut through. Helen slowly raised the gun and placed it on the table, not aiming, not threatening, just placing it there, in plain sight. That changed everything. Emily froze. Mark's back stiffened. The quiet dragged out until it became unbearable. Helen didn't speak. She didn't need to. She stood, lifted the gun, and without warning, without giving them time to explain, lie or run, she fired the first shot. Emily collapsed instantly, a red stain blooming across her chest as her body crumpled to the floor. Mark lunged toward Helen, but she was faster. The second shot struck him in the abdomen. He dropped to the floor beside Emily, gasping, reaching for her hand as blood poured between his fingers. Helen stood over them, shaking but calm. The gun in her hand trembled slightly, but her face was blank, empty of rage, tears, or regret. She looked at the two people she had loved most in the world, now lifeless or near it, and finally felt the silence break. Not with sound, but with a sudden, crushing clarity. She turned, walked to the phone, and dialed. "I just shot my husband and daughter," she said quietly, when the dispatcher answered. She gave her name, the address, and set the phone down. Then she sat back at the kitchen table, the gun resting beside her once more, and waited for the sirens to come. The town of Maple Grove woke up to the sound of sirens and flashing red lights that painted the early morning sky. Neighbors stepped out in robes and slippers, drawn to the Carter home by the kind of commotion they'd never seen in their quiet cul-de-sac. Officers surrounded the house, paramedics rushed in, and yellow tape stretched across the perfect white porch where Helen Carter sat calmly, hands folded in her lap, as if waiting for company. Inside, the scene was frozen in horror. Emily lay lifeless in a pool of blood near the kitchen island. Mark, barely clinging to life, was rushed to the hospital, where he would spend 3 days in intensive care before succumbing to his wounds. The family everyone had admired for years had shattered in a matter of seconds, and no one could make sense of it. Helen was taken into custody without resistance. She made no attempt to flee or explain. Her expression remained eerily calm. When asked if she wanted an attorney, she simply nodded. Her silence was louder than any confession. Detective Lila Monroe was assigned to the case that same afternoon. She had solved complicated homicides before, domestic disputes, revenge killings, hidden affairs, but something about this one felt different. There was no warning, no history of violence, no trace of drugs, no history of mental illness. Monroe began digging, determined to uncover what had pushed a woman like Helen Carter, a principal, a mother, a community figure, to commit the unthinkable. At first, everything pointed to emotional instability. A sudden psychotic break, maybe. But Monroe wasn't convinced. She began with the physical evidence. Helen's laptop, Mark's computer, Emily's phone, the flash drive hidden in the office. What she found only deepened the mystery. The apartment downtown was real, rented under a false name, paid for in cash, no paper trail leading back to Helen. Inside, the place was oddly bare. A mattress on the floor, a few clothes, toothbrushes, half-empty shampoo bottles, 2 plates in the sink. There were no signs of romantic entanglement, no love notes, no photos of the two together. It didn't fit the theory of a twisted affair. There was intimacy, yes, but not of the kind most suspected. Then came the DNA report. Monroe had ordered it quietly, not expecting much, just a routine comparison, a way to eliminate any strange possibilities. But when the results came back, the case shifted entirely. Mark Carter was not Emily's biological father. That single detail unraveled everything. Records showed Emily had been adopted at birth through a private agency, a detail Helen had known from the start. But what she hadn't known, what no one had known, was who Emily's birth family was. According to confidential documents sealed away in a safe deposit box rented under Mark's name, Emily's biological mother was Mark's own mother. A young woman at the time of birth, she had given the baby up in secret. Mark had never known she existed, until recently. 2 years before the murder, Mark had begun tracing his family tree using an online DNA service. That's how he found Emily. She had unknowingly submitted her DNA to the same database for a college project. Their connection had been flagged, triggering a quiet investigation on his end. Eventually, he confirmed it. Emily was his half-sister, not his daughter. He never told Helen. Instead, he slowly began building a relationship with Emily based on the secret they shared. They kept it from Helen, unsure of how she'd react, unsure of whether the truth would ruin the family they had tried to hold together. But in trying to protect that secret, they created something worse. Something that felt like betrayal, even if it wasn't. Something that to Helen, in her isolation and confusion, looked like a dark and twisted lie. By the time she discovered the truth, it was already too late. Detective Lila Monroe sat alone in the Carter home days after Helen's arrest, her eyes scanning the nearly empty living room. The crime scene tape had been removed, but the air still felt heavy, thick with the memory of what had taken place. Dust floated in the golden light that spilled through the windows, landing on a framed family photo that had fallen during the chaos. Mark, Helen, and Emily, smiling in front of a Christmas tree frozen in time, unaware of what would come. Monroe had uncovered the blood ties between Emily and Mark. That discovery explained the secrecy, the downtown apartment, and the strange closeness between the two, but something still didn't sit right. Helen had killed without warning, without a note, without a message to the world about why she did what she did. The facts were clear, but the motive still felt murky. Even if the truth about Emily's parentage was devastating, the rawness of Helen's reaction seemed too violent, too immediate. There was something more beneath the surface. As Monroe combed through Mark's home office for a final review, she found a locked drawer she hadn't noticed before. The key had been taped to the underside of the desk, clever but not enough to fool her. Inside, she found a stack of letters bundled with a rubber band. Most were addressed to one person, Jake Holloway. Jake had been Mark's best friend since college. He was a familiar face at family gatherings, always smiling, always helpful. To outsiders, Jake was just the loyal friend, kind, generous, and trustworthy. But the letters revealed another side. They detailed long conversations between Mark and Jake about Emily's discovery, how to tell Helen, and what the fallout might be. One particular letter, written in shaky handwriting just a month before the murders, stood out. Mark had written, "She's starting to sense something. Jake, we can't keep this up. Emily's uncomfortable with the secrecy. I think Helen knows. You promised we'd tell her together, but now you're backing out again. If anything happens, it's on both of us." Monroe's eyes narrowed. Jake hadn't just known about the truth, he had helped conceal it. Further down in the drawer, she found an old envelope labeled "Hospital Records." Inside were adoption papers, DNA test results, and a handwritten note from Jake himself. "Burn after reading, we tell her when she's stronger." But they never told her. Instead, Helen had been left to discover fragments of a hidden truth, alone, surrounded by people pretending nothing was wrong. She'd watched her husband and daughter whisper behind closed doors. She'd found a secret apartment. She'd uncovered coded messages and unspoken fears. And while she unraveled this web, her husband and his best friend watched her sink into confusion without ever reaching out a hand. When Monroe questioned Jake later that evening, he was calm at first. He denied involvement, called the tragedy unimaginable, claimed Mark had sworn him to secrecy. But when she showed him the letters, the calm melted into visible fear. "She wasn't supposed to find out like that," Jake said quietly. "We were going to tell her, gently, together." But then Mark kept putting it off. And Emily, she started asking too many questions. "What were you really afraid of?" Monroe asked. Jake didn't answer. But Monroe had her answer already. Jake had feared Helen's reaction. Not because she was unstable, but because she was perceptive. And the more she learned, the more dangerous her silence became. In the end, Helen hadn't just been betrayed by her husband and daughter. She had been betrayed by the one person outside her family who should have told her the truth. The third betrayal, quiet, calculated, and cruel, had come from the man who claimed to be Mark's best friend, and it may have been the one that finally pushed her over the edge. Helen Carter sat motionless in the courtroom, her expression blank as the judge read the verdict. The words echoed through the packed room, but she didn't flinch. Guilty on 2 counts of second-degree murder. A sentence of 35 years. No emotion passed across her face. Not anger, not fear, not sorrow. She simply nodded, as if the decision had been made long before the trial even began. Reporters lined the steps outside the courthouse, waiting for a glimpse of her as officers led her away. Her case had become national news. A mother shooting her own daughter, and husband inside their quiet suburban home. No warning, no confession, no defense. The headlines called her a monster, a woman unhinged. But Detective Lila Monroe knew it wasn't that simple. Helen hadn't snapped. She hadn't acted out of madness. She had acted out of betrayal, the kind that builds slowly and poisons everything it touches. In the months that followed the sentencing, Monroe kept returning to the pieces of the case that still didn't quite fit. She had solved the how and who. She even understood the why, but something about the final hours still gnawed at her. Something about the timing, the silence, the coldness of Helen's act. It was too clean, too exact. As if Helen hadn't just reacted, but made a decision. Monroe returned to the evidence locker, reviewing every item recovered from the Carter home. That's when she found it. A sealed envelope that had been overlooked during the first sweep. It was tucked inside a cookbook in the kitchen, one Helen used often. The front was unmarked. Inside was a single sheet of paper, typed, not handwritten. The note read, "By the time anyone reads this, it will be too late. I found out everything, not just about the apartment or the lies. I found out what they were planning. They weren't going to tell me. Not the truth, not the full truth. Emily was never just Mark's sister. She was something else. A second life he had tried to keep hidden. A mistake he wanted to erase and rebuild. I was never supposed to see it, but I did. I saw everything. What they were to each other, what they were to me. The betrayal didn't start with the secret, it started with the silence. And now I've broken it." No name, no signature, no explanation of what everything meant. Just one final sentence underlined in bold. Sometimes justice has to come from the ones left out of the story. Monroe read the note 3 times before folding it back into the envelope. She never submitted it into evidence. Some truths, she decided, didn't belong in court records. Some truths only mattered to the person who carried them. Jake Holloway never attended Helen's sentencing. He disappeared from Maple Grove 2 weeks after the trial, selling his house and vanishing without a word. Rumors spread he had moved abroad, changed his name, started over. But Monroe suspected he simply couldn't face what he had helped create. In prison, Helen refused all visits. No journalists, no lawyers, no relatives. She lived in silence, kept to herself, and never spoke about what happened that morning in her kitchen. The warden said she was quiet but not withdrawn, calm but watchful. As if she still carried something unsaid, as if she was waiting. Years passed, the Carter home was sold, remodeled, repainted. A new family moved in. The neighbors pretended the tragedy was behind them, but the shadow of what happened never left. They avoided the subject. They crossed the street without looking too long. Everyone remembered, but no one talked. And somewhere in the back of their minds, they all wondered the same thing. What did Helen really see that morning? And what secret stayed buried with her silence?